The 6th of January 2025, and well, for want of something better to do with my time, I thought I'd try and do something a bit more useful today. So following up on a story I recently publicised on this channel concerning the woeful lack of conventional defences for the United Kingdom, I thought I'd do a little bit more digging, and I discovered another defence analyst working for a major UK newspaper who had done even more research into this and discovered some worrying features about the UK's current defence posture. Now, considering all the things which have been going on in Ukraine recently, forgive me, just reset the angle a little bit, the Russians now are openly bragging about a missile they have, which is basically an intercontinental ballistic missile, a long-range missile, incidentally, but one which is not armed with nuclear weapons at all, but is actually armed with a conventional warhead. But because it's a ballistic missile, and for those of you not familiar with rocketry and things of that sort, a ballistic missile is normally fired completely out of Earth's atmosphere on a gigantic parabolic arc, which then re-enters the atmosphere at very high speeds, usually in excess of 10 times the speed of sound, and then splits up into individual warheads, usually about 6 of these smaller warheads, and normally they would be individually targeted nuclear warheads. But since Vladimir Putin is now threatening to use this type of non-nuclear weapon, potentially in Ukraine and maybe other places, the United Kingdom is uniquely undefended against such a possible threat because, for one thing, a non-nuclear ballistic missile attack on a NATO country does not meet the criteria for what's known as Article 5 of NATO, which is the nuclear response to a nuclear attack, because it's not a nuclear attack. And the United Kingdom, it's been revealed in this defence analysis, is uniquely under-defended against aerial threats which are not nuclear. In other words, if Russia were to launch a nuclear first strike at the United Kingdom and potentially trying to obliterate all of it, there would be perhaps just enough time for our one nuclear submarine in the Atlantic somewhere to fire a salvo of 16 missiles in retaliation, aimed mostly at Moscow, ensuring mutually assured destruction, or MAD as it's sometimes known. However, that wouldn't happen in this case, and if Putin is ever to make good on his threats to use non-nuclear intercontinental long-range ballistic missiles, then the United Kingdom is basically a sitting duck, because in order to shoot these things down, you need another high-altitude missile interceptor which can shoot this missile down outside of the Earth's atmosphere before it re-enters the atmosphere and before it splits up into its individual 6 warheads. And because of that, the United Kingdom is struggling. It doesn't have a conventional air defence system in the way that you might think we have. We do, as somebody rightly pointed out, have multiple squadrons of modern fighters all across the United Kingdom, based in places like Lookers, and these take the form of Typhoon interceptors. These are supersonic Mach 2 interceptor fighter aircraft which are capable of bringing down Russian bombers and other, shall we say, lower flying threats such as cruise missiles. But unfortunately, we don't have a Patriot defense system like the Americans have, which is capable of shooting down ballistic missiles coming in from space at hypersonic speeds. And because of that, a non-nuclear strike against somewhere like Coalport or Faslane could take out our entire nuclear base without a nuclear strike, and there would be nothing that the UK could really do about it, because we just simply don't have an anti-ballistic missile system up to the job. Now, it's further been revealed also in this analysis that the United Kingdom's budget, its defence budget, only about 1.6% of it is actually earmarked for conventional weaponry. In other words, things like bombs, missiles, bullets and things of that kind, which are non-nuclear. And that leaves the entire defence posture of the UK completely unbalanced in favour of nuclear deterrence only, with a fractional amount of money to be spent on its standing army, which, as I mentioned in a previous episode, has been reduced from its original level of 85,000 troops to somewhere in the region of 60. So the UK is uniquely sensitive and vulnerable to aerial attacks of this type. And these kinds of weapons could be used to knock out all of our power stations, which are completely and in fact not even under-defended, they're completely not defended against such threats. We have nuclear power stations such as Hunterston, for example, Torness. These would be tempting targets for somebody like Putin if he wanted to cause a major radiological problem for the whole of the UK, not least of which would be other things like blowing up the Coalport arsenal, which contains nuclear warheads. Now, a conventional warhead detonating in such a place would probably not set off a nuclear explosion, but it would make such weapons unusable and could wreck an entire port, not to mention an entire city if enough of them were fired. So these things are real, and these things are a real threat. So the United Kingdom really is in a bit of a bind. It needs to spend more on its defence, and according to Sir Keir Starmer, he's planning on increasing our defence spend to 2.6% of our gross domestic product, which is a fair amount of money, but most of it seems to be getting spent on nuclear-armed submarines and not on conventional defensive systems. So that was a follow-up on what I reported on earlier this week. Now, the second part of this program, I wanted to discuss a new idea. Now, this is a new idea which, to me, is just a brainwave at the moment, but I thought it might be worth discussing it with you. I've called it the Spartacus Initiative. And those of you who are as ancient as me might remember there was a very famous Hollywood movie about Spartacus, who was originally a slave in the Roman Empire and rose to the ranks of being a very famous gladiator in the arenas of Rome. And there's a famous scene in that movie where Spartacus is wanted by the Romans, and they gather a whole huge mob of slaves and say, which one of you is Spartacus? And one by one they all stand up and say, I'm Spartacus, I'm Spartacus. Now, if you just take that as the inspiration for this idea, one of the problems that Scotland faces at the moment, as far as I can see, is that independent supporters like myself, who are not enamoured, shall we say, too much of the main independence party, the SNP, or for that matter, at the moment, that much enamoured with ALBA. The ISP, yes, but the ISP is, I would say, a much smaller party than the other two, at the moment anyway. But the reason I mention the parties is that it's hard to see John Swinney or his administration coming up with any viable way of achieving independence in the next couple of years, despite the fact that there is obviously a Scottish election in 2026. So I wanted to put this out here to you, an idea which I've been thinking about for a while. Now, it must be obvious to all of you that one of the problems with politicians is that politicians view their jobs as a career. And when you view your job as a career, you want to be in power or an MSP or an MP for as long as possible. Now, unfortunately, that does not square with the goal of achieving independence. So how do we get the SNP, which, let's face it, is likely to win the majority of seats at the next general election in Holyrood, how do we get that party, under John Swinney or anybody else, to actually legislate to hold another referendum? I think the obvious way to put pressure on any Scottish government, especially one which at the moment is a minority government which requires help to govern, would be for us, that is the independence movement at large, to come up with our own candidates for MSP jobs, but not in the first past the post voting system, but in what's known as the regional list. Now, in the regional list, the smaller parties have an advantage. If we were to field, let us say we managed to get 56 Spartacuses who are prepared to stand up and say, I'm going to run as a candidate for independence only, and that is the only reason I'm standing, and if I am elected, and there are enough of us from this Spartacus Initiative elected, we will then only go into a coalition or a support package deal of some sort with the SNP on the condition that the SNP legislates, first of all, to take back all parliamentary powers to Holyrood, and then uses those powers to hold a referendum. Now remember that the Greens have now been cast aside by the SNP. Quite famously, I think Hamza Yusuf cast them adrift during his brief tenure as First Minister. But in doing so, he basically got rid of one of the SNP's key allies in previous administrations, leaving the SNP largely by itself, with only ALBA perhaps, and maybe one or two ISP candidates getting elected on the list to try to balance up this imbalance. If we, as an independence movement, could produce 56 volunteers, now remember there are 56 regional seats up for election in the list. If we can field a candidate in every constituency on the basis that they will, if elected, hold the SNP to an agreement to hold, first of all, a referendum at some point in the very near future, but moreover to take back all parliamentary powers to Holyrood in defiance of Westminster first, and then use that power that they now have to hold an independence referendum. If we can get 56 people to stand up and say they want to stand on that single manifesto pledge, we could probably take seats from a lot of other parties. Now, in suggesting this, I'm very mindful of the fact that a lot of the smaller parties, and I'm talking about the Scottish Socialist Party, I'm also talking about the Independence for Scotland Party and ALBA here, are not going to be too happy about competing against individuals who've come from the movement but who are not members of their parties. However, it's perfectly legitimate for us to do this, although we could come to agreements with parties such as ALBA and the ISP not to stand candidates in places where they're likely to pick up seats. But it's very important that we have a cohort which is large enough to make sure that a minority SNP government, which is probably what we might end up with in 2026, is forced to go into a coalition on the basis that it will take back all these powers and will hold a referendum in a set time frame. The Spartacus Initiative is, at the moment, as I said, just an idea in my head, but I thought I would get it out to you, the viewers, to have a chat about this. I've also intimated this idea to Peter Bell recently in a comment on one of his own posts, that this might be a way we could go. Now, obviously, this needs to be funded. It costs money to put up the fee necessary to stand any candidate in any election. And then there is the cost of running a campaign. But since all of these candidates would be standing on the same manifesto pledge under, let's say, the name the Spartacus Party, or whatever you want to call it, but if they're all standing on that same manifesto, then it only needs one campaign for all of them. And that campaign is independence only, take back full powers to the Scottish Parliament, and then stage that referendum. And that is the entire manifesto. We would need to raise enough money to mount a serious campaign, and I would suggest, based on the successfulness of Donald Trump's campaigning, where he uses almost entirely social media to get his message across and to get himself electable in the American sense of the word, there's no reason why we couldn't do the same. After all, programs like this and many other small podcasts and online shows like this go out to tens of thousands of people every day. And I would hope that this program is still going out to tens of thousands of people every day. In general terms, approximately, and I'm gauging this by both my YouTube feed and also other people who also publish my material, that approximately 5,000 people watch each of these programs all the way through. And that's an approximation, but that's still a large number. And out of that 5,000, I'll bet you there are at least 56 of those viewers who might be prepared to say, yeah, I'm Spartacus, I'll stand up and I will be a candidate. But we need a campaign manager, and we need people to support those candidates. So this requires a structure. And one of the reasons I'm mentioning it now is that it's exactly the sort of thing which Peter Bell's New Scotland Party might be interested in supporting. Since his party, the New Scotland Party, isn't going to stand candidates, he might be amenable to helping us try to set this up, or at least to publicise it through his regular blogs, and also through the regular blogs, radio broadcasts from the likes of Caledon Radio and other outlets on social media. So we have still got the major media weapon of social media to use. And it's really a question of having not just one leader who is easy to pick off or easy to target by the mainstream media, but 56 Spartacuses who are all standing in different places. Maybe it'll be less than that. If we decide that we don't want to stand against ALPA, for example, or ISP in individual constituencies or individual regions, then that could be agreed in advance. But I have this number of pro-independence candidates who are prepared to basically make the SNP hold the referendum if they are minority government. That really rebalances the entire picture. And this seems to me at least one possible way in which all of us could influence the outcome of the 2026 general election in Scotland, so that first of all we get all of our parliamentary powers back, and we use those powers to hold the independence referendum, which has been denied to us by the United Kingdom, which is basically acting as a colonial master race here and is not allowing us access to democracy. That goes hand in hand with what Salvo is trying to do with the International Court of Justice and the United Nations in establishing our right to self-determination in the first place. But a multi-pronged approach like this could work. It would need to raise a lot of money, several £100s for each candidate, as to actually register as a candidate to fight in this election, and then a major campaign to support all of them with the same manifesto pledge, and to train each and every one of them how to speak in front of cameras and how to get their message across on social media. So there's a lot of things that you would need to do for this to work. But I would like you, my viewers, to contact me and to talk about this on your own social media feeds as well. See what you think of this idea. Is it viable? Is it doable? Could we raise enough money amongst the tens of thousands of independent supporters who are out there who are not party members? And remember, even if you are a party member, you could still support this effort if you wanted to, just as an individual. So that's the idea at the moment for the Spartacus Initiative. But to me, it is the right sort of initiative because it diversifies the leadership. It's not a party. It's a group of individual Spartacuses, if that's the correct collective term, who are all standing on the same manifesto pledge in the regional lists. Now remember that the Unionists have 3 parties standing in the regional lists. The SNP's second votes often lose more seats than they gain. In fact, I think they had something like 400,000 votes in the most recent general election. That only got them 2 seats. Whereas other parties with a few tens of thousands were picking up list seats. And that's really all we have to do, is get our candidates picking up those few thousand votes each, and we could get ourselves a good big handful of seats, maybe enough to hold the balance of power in a new pro-independence government. Anyway, those are my thoughts for today. Think of that and get back to me and let me know what you think. Anyway, that's all I've got time for today. But I'll be rejoining you, I hope, later on in the week, and hopefully we'll get some interesting feedback from this idea. See what you think of it, let me know, and if it's worth pursuing, then we should do it. Anyway, that's it from Inde-Car today. Keep the faith, but remember, where there's a will, there's a way. And where there's 56 Spartacuses, there's 56 ways. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye for now.